So, good morning and welcome to this second panel of the academic session. My name is Kari Osland. I am a senior researcher at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, Oslo, Norway, and it's a great pleasure for me to moderate this session today. So, the focus of this session and this panel is resilience to violent extremism in Southeast Europe. I'm pleased to have such an excellent panel with me today, and I will present them briefly as we go along. I will follow the same format as we had in the first panel, namely that each of the panelists will talk for a maximum of 15 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A session towards the end. So, let me start with Marija Ignjatjević. She's a researcher at the Belgrade Center for Security Policy since September 2017. I will not present the full CV of my fellow panelists because you have already seen that online on the video. But I will say that Marija will present a paper that she has written together with Predrag Petrovic, also from BCSP, and who was the moderator in panel 1. She wrote this paper for the EU-funded project PREVEX. So please, Marija, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ms. Osland, and good morning to everyone, and thank you to all the participants, both here in Belgrade and those joining us online. As Ms. Osland already mentioned, I will present today on research findings that focused on resilience to religious extremism in Serbia, more precisely in southwestern region of Serbia, Sandžak, that I conducted with my colleague Predrag Petrovic during this summer. So I will present predominantly very fresh empirical data, empirical findings, rather than necessarily placing them into some conceptual frameworks. Firstly, I will start by explaining why we chose this specific region and this specific topic for our research. Namely, the Sandžak region has attracted a great level of attention since early 2000s, precisely for the issue of violent extremism. And it has attracted this attention up until 2016, maybe when the outflow of foreign fighters from Serbia was curbed. And many international experts and also domestic experts had very dark and gloomy projections for this region and have deemed it as, and characterized it as a hotbed of extremists, a hotbed of terrorists, and so on. But however, now in 2021, we can see that this threat has actually never realized, and that a community in Sandžak has demonstrated a great level of resilience to violent religious extremism. And that, in fact, in the past few years, this threat of violent extremism has decreased. So that's why we decided to focus on the region of Sandžak to try to identify some of the main factors or actors or drivers of resilience. Now, the overall impression throughout our research is that it was actually mentioned in the previous panel as well, that radicalization and drivers of radicalization and drivers of resilience very often, not always, but very often present two different sides of the same coin, and that it's often a very thin line between radicalization and resilience. And I will elaborate in more detail through some examples that I will mention from our empirical findings about this. But nevertheless, it's a very slippery terrain for decision makers and for all those involved in designing maybe preventive strategies when it comes to violent extremism. Now, I will go into the very factors of resilience that we have identified. Firstly, when it comes to Sandžak, role of the local community has been of a crucial importance in preventing the expansion of violent extremism. What I mean under the role of communities, firstly, the Muslim communities in the Balkans are traditionally practicing moderate interpretation of Islam and are traditionally oriented towards Hanafi school of thought in Islam. And hence, radical and ultra-conservative groups and individuals and beliefs that have emerged in Sanjak were somewhat alien to the local community when it first showed up. And the community reacted with, firstly with some curiosity and maybe surprise, but very soon this transformed into rejection and even resistance. So the local community has expressed this resistance through maybe, for example, boycotting of shops or restaurants, or avoiding to socialize with members of this radical Salafi community that has emerged in early 2000s and later. And firstly, this had a negative effect of these radical individuals and groups, and it made them withdraw into their own circles and to isolate and distance from the community. And naturally, this would be, and it was for some time, a factor of radicalization, and it contributed to their grievances. However, as the time passed, and coupled with some external factors, such as the delusion with the foreign fighting and the war in Syria, this isolation from the community actually had a sobering effect on these radical individuals and groups. They have concluded, they have realized that they cannot lead normal lives in that way, and that they have to moderate their views, practices, and beliefs in order to reintegrate into the society. And that's exactly what happened. So now the society has accepted them back, and they are now part of normal social lives and even official religious institutions. But this is precisely what I was talking about, the slippery terrain and the thin line between radicalization and resilience, because now these groups and individuals who are still very ultra-conservative, maybe they have moderated, they toned down their views, they still practice very ultra-conservative version of Islam, they are now part of the official religious institutions. They have access to official channels, and to they can reach more people. And in that sense, this can potentially, this driver of resilience can in the future be potentially a driver of radicalization at the same time. And now, besides the wider community and members of the community, there were some prominent figures that played an essential role in preventing the spread of extremism. First is the group of Imams, for sure, but not only moderate Imams, who were moderate from the beginning till the end, who certainly enjoy great reputation and play a great role in the community of believers, but also some Imams who used to be radical in the first place. So who actually belonged to these radical Salafi communities and have in the beginning contributed to radicalization and to spreading of violent extremist ideas. They, for example, have been very vocal and active in promoting and presenting atrocities in the Syrian war, and thus paving the way for recruitment of foreign fighters. At some point, they made quite a U-turn and have started promoting a moderate version of religious beliefs, and have basically moderated themselves. And our interlocutors have expressed or have explained this with many background reasons. Some of them are internal, such as maybe that security services have simply exerted pressure over these individuals to stop spreading radical ideas. However, we found one external factor very interesting when it comes to these radical Imams. Since many of these radical Imams were educated and studied in Saudi Arabia, our interlocutors have highlighted that religious and political reforms in Saudi Arabia have actually influenced to a great extent these Imams in Serbia. So basically, when the religious reforms in Saudi Arabia have taken roots, some of these radical Imams in Sanjak have simply, let's say, taken a bit more moderate stance. And I will just give one example. For instance, when some of the Saudi ultra-conservative clerics would fall in disfavor of Crown Prince bin Salman, then Sanjak Imams would simply stop referring to them in their sermons, would delete their posts referring to them in their social media and so on. So these changes in Saudi Arabia were certainly one of the factors that contributed to preventing actually the spread of violent extremist ideas. Now, besides Imams, there were some other influential people or individuals within the community who had an essential role in building resilience. I will just mention one example of a person who probably had the most important role in preventing young people from going to Middle Eastern battlefields. That is one person from Sanjak named Asad Kundakovic, whose son tragically died in Syria back in 2013. And after this tragic event, he embarked on a personal mission of preventing other young people from making the same mistake. And really, Predrag and myself have conducted around 30 interviews in the Sanjak regions, and almost all of our interlocutors agreed that he played an essential role in preventing these young people from radicalizing and from going in Syria. And his authority was based not just on this direct connection with foreign fighting and based on his son, but also on the fact that he came from a very respectable and honorable family in the community, so he had some kind of authority within with the youth in Sanjak. And I will also pinpoint the last, let's say, large group or maybe new findings that we came across while conducting this research, and that is the role that Sanjak diaspora had in mitigating actually grievances of the community and thus contributing to resilience to violent extremism. Namely, Sanjak has a really huge diaspora, predominantly in Western European countries and Turkey. And this diaspora helps and supports the region to a great extent in terms of supporting it financially and thus mitigating economic grievances and helping with the poor economic situation. So we have concluded that this help coming from diaspora, both in direct assistance to maybe family members or humanitarian organizations, but also to by investing in the region, opening some small businesses and so on, it helped to a great extent in simply building the resilience of the community. And I will finish with this, precisely as with each of these drivers of resilience, we can see the other side, which might be a factor of radicalization. And when it comes to diaspora, it was very visible and prominent during the pandemics, how the local community reacted to the help that came from diaspora. Namely, at the beginning of the pandemics, Sanjak region was really severely struck by COVID-19 wave, and it caught health institutions and local authorities unprepared for the pandemics, and that's when diaspora jumped in and helped a lot. And afterwards, some public opinion polls showed that actually citizens have recognized this support and that they have recognized diaspora as the main actor that helped them in this health crisis. So in that sense, maybe this help, relying on this help on diaspora can further undermine trust in central government or local institutions, and in that sense can be a potential in the future driver of radicalization. So to conclude, I would once again highlight that it's very hard to identify and to divide drivers of radicalization and drivers of resilience, and that they very often present two different sides of the same coin. So the grievances of one community and the push factors and these drivers of radicalization should not be underestimated and forgotten when we're speaking about resilience.
Thank you so much, Maria. I think you managed to showcase very well how this is very complex and the two sides of resilience and radicalization. So let's move on to Evlogi Stanchev, who is an assistant professor at the Institute of Balkan Studies and Center for Thrakology at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. And Dr. Stanchev will present a paper which is also part of the PREVEX, the EU-funded PREVEX project. And you have written this paper together with Stoyan Doklev, yes. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kari, and thanks to the organizers. It's an honor to be at such a prestigious event. Currently, I'm a research member of the Center for Advanced Studies, Sofia, within the framework of the PREVEX, International PREVEX project. And with my colleague Stoyan, we did an extensive field research in August this year in the Republic of North Macedonia. In addition to semi-structured anthropological interviews, we did ethnographic observance also. And I will try to sketch our findings as brief as possible to not steal any time of time of my colleagues. Within our study, we focused on several main aspects concerning violent extremism and preventing and countering violent extremism in North Macedonia. As you all know, of utmost significance concerning this subject is the concept of enabling environment. So the first aspect which was of great interest for us was how do we define as an enabling environment in a specific case of North Macedonia. So of particular importance for our research is to delineate the context sensitivity of this concept, which for our team is very important. There is a lack of university applicable definition, I think, for this concept, and our empirical observations confirm this absolutely. In the specific case of North Macedonia, one should bear in mind that there are several particular cases of seemingly identical situations of different enabling conditions that, however, may share some significant differences between each other, but in similarities between each other. So from our extensive field work, we focus on several main conditions that facilitate the enabling environment in North Macedonia. Namely, they are the social and economic conditions that are usually put at the top. But however, based on the many interviews we did before and during the fieldwork, our team is not sure whether factors of this category alone are sufficient to talk for the emergence of an enabling environment. In essence, specific objective factors such as social marginalization or poor economic development can provoke reactions that are not necessarily related to the phenomenon of violent extremism, although often no less violent in their essence. An axiomatic example in this sense is organized crime, which is not violent extremism, but is violent either, which is a widespread phenomenon in the whole Balkan region, not only in North Macedonia. The second factor, the demographic conditions, for us were very important because they showed the varying degrees of radicalization and respectively of resilience in the context of North Macedonia. You know, the political conditions are very often influential regarding violent extremism, and the case of North Macedonia is not an exception. I will add psychological and ideological conditions also that help us to delineate which can provoke enabling environment and which can provoke resilience to it. So in conclusion, we suggest that one of the fundamental research questions of our study, which is very interesting for the whole PREVEX project also, namely whether the context of the Western Balkans and the case of North Macedonia, respectively in particular, can be defined as an example of enabling environment for the occurrence of violent extremism, is too broad and not subject to one anonymous answer. So to analyze this concept of enabling environments, we have to analyze it along with the various drivers, local and regional, for occurrence and respectively the factors for resilience, for non-occurrence of violent extremism. So I will briefly sketch the drivers of violent extremism in North Macedonia. Some of these drivers were already discussed widely in previous academic and policy papers, but others were observed during our empirical research. So as a push factors, I will sketch social exclusion and marginalization, economic instability and grievances, ethnic divisions, which is of utmost significance for the case of North Macedonia, lack of quality education, both secular and religious, which were often cited as a very serious issue by many respondents in North Macedonia. Of course, the continuous political crisis which define the present situation of North Macedonia is of utmost importance and can be as a driver, specific driver for violent extremism. Also, the general lack of independent and socially responsible media, the internal struggles and crises within the Islamic religious community of Macedonia. This is the official, let's say, religious organization concerning Muslims in Macedonia. Also, I will point the prison conditions and the effectiveness of the rehabilitation programs in Republic of North Macedonia. The proliferation of hate speech, which was really serious according to our respondents during the times of the previous government of the nationalist Vemerol Depemeni and Prime Minister Nikola Gruevski. And one recent push driver, the COVID-19 crisis and its implications, which we are all facing. As a pull factors for violent extremism at North Macedonia, I will highlight especially the ideological motivation, which, according to our study, represents leading pull factor for radicalization in Macedonian society. Although during the last years, the danger of Islamist extremism has significantly decreased, mostly due to the disintegration of the so-called Islamic State and to several coordinated counter-terrorist operations conducted by the Macedonian services, there are many sleeping cells of jihadist organizations, which was information provided to us by specialists in the security services agencies. Another factors are the alienation from the state, the traumatic historical legacies, which are also a specific factor for not only for North Macedonia, but in the whole Western Balkan case. The identity shifts, by which I mean an often process of dynamics of identity, self-identification. And this, the particular case of so-called Macedonian-speaking Muslims, commonly known as Torbeshi, is very illustrative in this aspect. Many times they are influenced by external actors and identified as started to identify themselves as Turks or Albanians, which is really widespread among segments of this group nowadays. And of course, building and maintaining infrastructures of extremist organizations is very important, and as a factor. And according to these factors, we managed to visit and analyze several cases of occurrence and non-occurrence in North Macedonia. I will sketch them briefly. The cases of occurrence, which are very popular among academia and policy papers, policy scientists, There are several Muslim-dominated municipalities in the city of Skopje, namely the neighborhoods of Čair, Gazibaba, and Sarai. Also the city of Kumanovo and its immediate hinterland, and especially the municipality of Lipkovo, is another case of occurrence. And we will add several villages situated around the cities of Struga, Debar, and Kičevo, and in the region of southwestern North Macedonia, most notably the villages of Oktisi, Lobunište, Podgorci, and Plasnica. These are predominantly Macedonian-speaking Muslim villages. And although counted as examples of the same category, namely occurrence, it should be noted that these localities differ in terms of their degree of occurrence, as some of them have significantly more deep-rooted traditions of radicalization and the spread of extremist ideas. On the other hand, I will present briefly the cases of non-occurrence. The city of Debar in southwestern Macedonia serves an ideal example of tolerance between the ethno-religious communities. We often heard during our fieldwork the explanation that the local predominantly Albanian-speaking community consists of so-called starosedelci, which literally means old natives, who form an old and traditional community for the regions, and often respondents contrasted these old natives with the Kosovo migrants from the Kumanovo region, for example. These differing features within the Albanian group itself are very important and serve as a clear warning to not essentialize one community as being radical per se. This goes not only for Albanians but for other communities concerning our research. The other regions which are important as examples of non-occurrence of violent extremism is the historical and geographical region of Polog, namely the cities of Tetovo and Gostivar, the city of Struga, and the city of Kičevo. Kičevo proper, not the rural hinterland around it. What does this tell us about local resilience to violent extremism, which is the focus of our panel? Several different factors, as I already noted, shall be highlighted, and they illustrate certain local context and process, and as such should not be regarded as generally applicable to each environment vulnerable to the emergence of violent extremism. This is a really important insight of our study. So, as factors for local resilience to violent extremism, we suggest the following. Demographic factors. While partially recognizing the validity of the already popular concept that as mixed one region is, the more tolerant it is. Although we recognize some of the validity of this concept, our general conclusion is that one of the leading factors for local resilience, in fact, in the North Macedonian case, in fact, is the relative ethnic homogeneity of a region. Unfortunately, this was absolutely confirmed in the context of Debar, which was cited very often both by ethnic Macedonians and by Albanians as an ideal case of non-occurrence. But when asked if radicalization seems probable in this region, both groups, respondents from both groups, emphasized that if there is an influx, for example, of ethnic Macedonians in this region, cohesion will be disrupted, and the danger for friction and for instability will become bigger. As the second factor, which we perceive as very important for resilience, is the cultural factor. And we consider various aspects of identity, such as the existence of stable traditions of tolerance, as a fundamental factor for resilience. And as Maria noted about the so-called moderate or traditional Islam, the same goes for Macedonia too. The adherence to the so-called traditional Islam, for instance, among Albanians in Debar and Tetovo, serves as a factor for resilience against the penetration of external Puritanist, jihadi, Salafist trends of Islam. Educational factors are also really important. As I already mentioned, quality education, both secular and religious, is of utmost importance for strengthening local resilience. And here the examples of Debar and Tetovo serves as a good example. The Kumanovo serves as a bad example. The last two factors which I consider are very important, the political factors. In contrast to the prolonged political crisis in North Macedonia, which I briefly sketched, we can identify other factors, political factors, that on the contrary stimulate resilience to various social tensions. And here I will emphasize the example of the current authorities of the municipality of Kumanovo, which are setting as its main goal the creation of an inclusive environment, facilitating the socialization of different ethnic communities. And the last factor, institutional conditions, and namely structures such as the State Intelligence Agency of the Republic of North Macedonia and the National Committee of Countering Violent Extremism and Countering Terrorism should be mentioned, whose activities, although subject to some criticism by various observers, should be considered as effective so far. And if I can steal another last 15 seconds, in conclusion, I want to thank you for your attention. And I want especially to thank, on behalf of the Center for Advanced Studies Sofia, our colleagues from the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs for our fruitful cooperation so far within the framework of the Prevex project. And I sincerely hope that our cooperation will continue in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evlogi. I think you managed to present a very complex picture as well. I know you had 60 pages that you now have condensed into very, well, you have managed to present it in 15 minutes. And I think the factors of resilience also showcase the point Maria made earlier, that there are two sides of this. So great, thank you so much. We will now move over to Charles O. Warner III. You are a doctoral researcher with the University of Leuven, Belgium. And Mr. Warner, he's both a veteran and a social anthropologist. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's my first time in Belgrade, so very exciting to be here at the Belgrade Security Forum. I feel in good company. I keep hearing the word anthropology, fieldwork, interviews. It's very empowering as a social anthropologist myself. I'm not going to be presenting anything that's kind of connected strictly with my ongoing research project and current fieldwork. It's more about highlighting some of the theory and methodology that I've kind of encountered so far by speaking with war veterans in Southeast Europe, specifically as part of my ethnographic field work across Croatia, Slovenia, Serbia, and Kosovo, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I have a few prepared remarks. I was planning on a PowerPoint. I had a little bit of a easier delivery for the applied anthropology part of my discussion, but I'll ad-lib that a little bit. But combat veterans in the context of resilience to violent extremism or resilience period, I argue that combat veterans embody a unique multidimensional capacity for resilience. It is a capacity that builds from accumulated experiences of life and the taking of life during service in the armed forces, as well as from reflections on what it took to survive along the front lines. For many veterans, this sense of resilience also bespeaks the capacity to absorb, alter, or adapt to the challenges of civilian life after combat, challenges that range from personal health and finance to state bureaucracy and stereotypes. Altogether, such a capacity, though intrinsically linked to past experience in armed forces, may be engaged as an object of inquiry that contributes to dynamic considerations of resilience today. In so doing, there can emerge new opportunities to recognize contemporary roles for veterans in society, while also supporting a society's broader conceptualization of resilience. On that note, I hasten to add that this call should not be heard as an attempt to militarize the discourse space around resilience, nor militarize the very sense of resilience itself. On the contrary, veterans may be seen as extraordinarily adverse to such militarization, as we know all too well where such militarization can lead and what it costs. The emphasis here then is on past wartime experiences that shape present peacetime perspectives of veterans who, perhaps unseen or unaware of how we may continue to be of service to our societies, can be unique partners within a range of socio-political projects. And just a reminder to the very kind introduction, I use grammar such as we and ours, as I myself am a combat veteran, former explosive ordnance disposal technician of the American campaigns in Iraq. Thus, for this conversation, I speak as both researcher and veteran, and as such, didn't really think some form of third person was somewhat nonsensical. Following with the conference topic of resilience to violent extremism, I take an opportunity to focus a lens on the special relationship between veterans and resilience in a manner that seeks to inform broader concepts and methodology of resilience today. This approach works from an understanding that veterans and veteran collectives are potential, thus implicitly unrecognized contributors, or in the same vein, enablers and maintainers of resilience. In referring to the concept of resilience, I follow with anthropologist Roberto Berrios, who sees the capacity of a system, community, or society to adapt to hazards by resisting or changing in order to reach and maintain an acceptable level of functioning and structure. A definition I find quite intersectional with both veteran communities as well as communities within Southeast Europe that are having to deal with the issues that we find today with violent extremism and adapting or overcoming these elements. How then do veterans enact our experiences and perspectives to build our capacity for resilience? For we can see resilience as a performed, semi-innate tactic, acted and enacted, that guides how we handle and absorb the problems or difficulties faced as veterans in society. Furthermore, how can this capacity be engaged as an object of academic inquiry? What is needed from academia, and what doors must be opened by society to bring the lived experiences of veterans to the tasks of adapting to threats of extremism? Exploring these questions and the proposition of veterans contributing to capacities of resilience suggests a retheorization of the veteran in society is required. As envisioned, this retheorization works to enact a transnational and decentered and decolonized framework for holistic representation of the veteran within academia and society. A representation that acts to immediately foreground the totality of the veteran life world as a point of departure in any research or discourse that looks to veterans today, of course, in this context with resilience. So one possible way forward in this retheorization that I speak about in the paper that I put together for this conference is kind of returning to basics. And that means understanding that when we speak of the veteran, we are speaking of a guide and as a representative to an entire subjectivity. Now, this might seem a bit obvious to some and a bit unusual to others and remarkably basic for another set of people, but I argue that in that kind of back to basics approach, we are understanding how we might more fully engage with veterans within society, and then we can work through with the veterans as guides and as representatives to understand their dynamics, their impressions, their perspectives of resilience, and look at that to see how that can be incorporated into other considerations of resilience, specifically, hopefully, with respect to resilience to violent extremism. This one possible path forward, as well as some associated concepts such as veteranality, are part of the innate dynamics, speak to the innate dynamics, whether of resilience and remembrance, patriarchy and patriotism, gender and geography, or sickness and service that structure the veteran subjectivity. So in the paper, I kind of speak a little bit about what we need to get there. and to understand veteran subjectivity and to start to speak from a perspective of veteran subjectivity. Subjectivity being a very key word and fun word employed by anthropologists, and sometimes it's a little bit of a mystery, and sometimes it's a little bit of an oversight as well. So I argue that one of the things that we need is to ensure a coherence and a rigor with veteran studies, the study of the veteran, incorporating veteran studies into broader socio-academic conversations. We need to return to this idea of veteran subjectivity. And I'm ad-libbing a little bit here, and so this will be a little bit shorter of a presentation than I had really intended. But in identifying a need and subsequent path for this retheorization of the veteran within society, I'm following with the turns of anthropology towards ontology and reflexivity, and also as guided by a prime directive of decentering and decolonization within academia. Thus, I never miss a chance to point out the yet-to-be-countered North American, North Atlantic hegemony when it comes to the veteran studies and to some of these broader conversations. Not sure what that is, but okay. So that's one kind of point of departure, is looking at veteran subjectivity. Now, I didn't come here today just to speak about the retheorization of the veteran and just leave everybody hanging with theory and no practicality or application. So I also wanted to speak a little bit about applied anthropology. Some of the recent emergent fieldwork in applied anthropology has been dealing specifically or taking as a lens of inquiry disasters, catastrophe, and crisis. Now, while some of this does in fact touch specifically on the notions of resilience, maybe not necessarily to violent extremism, but a broader conceptualization of resilience, I think that some of this work ongoing in the past 5 years and a little bit before that can act as adaptive models for applied anthropological approaches to understanding resilience. And one of the key tools for applied anthropology, for anthropology period, is ethnography. And on that note, I kind of wanted to speak specifically to one particular dynamic of ethnography. Organizational anthropology, and by extension or using a toolkit that can be commonly referred to as organizational ethnography, I think is one way that we can approach an exploration and thus incorporation of veteran resilience into the conversations that we're having today. The anthropological study of organizations, and this is from Garston and Nyquist's book, Organizational Anthropology, Doing Ethnography in and Among Complex Organizations. The anthropological study of organizations thus brings to the fore the variability of organizational forms and the ways in which the distribution and exchange of resources contribute to the stabilizing and ordering of social activities. Reading this passage from Organizational Anthropology from the book, I cannot help but make more than a few connections with their declaration and the assembled ethnographic methodology as a methodology that we might ourselves incorporate toward understanding veteran resilience and social resilience, or not to qualify the social resilience, but just to kind of make a distinction there. Doubling down, I also see this articulation, a ready-made argument for the power and benefits of organizational ethnographies that take as objects of inquiry veteran associations and organizations. The resulting ethnographic narratives and insights would contribute to our understandings of what may be seen as a kind of infrastructural aspect to veteran world-making. In addition, it is necessary to conduct organizational ethnographies within established NGOs, civil society organizations, governmental initiatives, and any other organizations that are focused on resilience and violent extremism. These projects should include parameters that, along with other socio-academic considerations, allow for the exploration and investigation specific to identifying veteran inclusion, because I think that there's a lot of collaboration. I hope there's some veteran collaboration that we may not even know about yet. There might be some very informal veteran collaborations with NGOs, civil society organizations. And I think through an organizational ethnography, ethnographic field work that maps some of these veteran organizations in parallel with NGOs and civil societies, we might find spaces for collaboration, and we might already find some very informal or perhaps even formal partnerships. So in closing, with such an ethnographic strategy, we will begin to have a more robust, complete picture of organizations and their participants, as well as the capability to identify where veterans may already be active. This kind of collaboration may very well come to underpin reciprocal exchanges that emerge from macro and micro levels of observation that are twinned not only by theoretical concerns, but also by ethnographic practices. Again, this is from organizational anthropology. A collaboration that may open new vectors and fresh considerations of what resilience can mean, and in so doing contribute to our shared capacities of resilience to violent extremism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles, for bringing in veterans and the anthropological study of organizations into the thinking and discussion of resilience. Now, I will give the floor to Florian Bieber, who is with us online. He is a professor of Southeast Europe History and Politics and a director of the Center for Southeast European Studies at the University of Graz, Austria. Please, Professor Florian Bieber, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, and I'm glad to speak here. I regret not being able to be in Belgrade in person, and I'm sorry for having been looming above the screen of the other panelists. I saw it myself, and it seemed a little bit strange to be looking behind your backs. So anyhow, I'm going to present some considerations from a project, another EU-funded project called Connect, which is a Horizon 2020 project looking at the context of violent extremism in the MENA and Balkan societies. It is a project which is run by our partners in Barcelona, and I'm presenting these considerations in a kind of study which I've co-written with Laura Polojani, who is a researcher at the University of Graz as well. So our project overall, just like the other projects we've heard little parts of the work on, looks at drivers of radicalization in the Middle East and in the Balkans. And as you can already see by the framing from the European Union for this project, we have a particular way of which academic framework was given to how to think about that. And what I want to do is basically do two things in my presentation. The one part is to kind of give a conceptual thinking about the way we talk about violent extremism and maybe how we should rethink it. And the second one is the kind of drivers we've been looking at as the team, again, not as me individually, but as the larger team of the project, and to see what we can take from there. Now, the first part is really about this question about how do we frame violent extremism. And already here, I mean, two of my colleagues whose papers are extremely fascinating and very rich in empirical detail have focused primarily on violent extremism within Islamic communities. And I think this is exactly one of the big problems we're confronted with when we're talking about violent extremism. And this is, of course, very much, I think, the lens which we are given by the European Union and other external actors. A lot of the research in the Western Balkans in the last 6 or 7 years on violent extremism has been primarily focused on violent extremism associated with foreign fighters, with radicalization of particular types of Islam. And I would argue that that is already, and this is something which we've discussed in our research project, a problematic lens. That we are thinking of violent extremism in a particular way. Now, when we're discussing with our colleagues in the Middle East, and this research project has 4 countries in the Balkans, Bulgaria, North Macedonia, Kosovo, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, and in the Middle East, Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, and Jordan. Of course, in the Middle East, the primary driver of violent extremism is groups associated with a particular type of radical Islam, or at least an ideology which claims to be based on a particular religious grounding. But in the Balkans, I would say this is not the primary driver of violent extremism. We have violent extremism among other ideas and concepts, from radical nationalism to maybe participation in what I will come back to as some kind of civilizational projects, or based on other religions such as Orthodoxy. So I think we need to first of all critically reflect on why violent extremism is so much associated with Islam in the mental kind of mapping of this issue. And I'm very glad that my previous speaker talked about war veterans, which in other countries of the region are maybe more important actors of violent extremism potentially as well. Now, I think there are five dimensions of the problem of this current dominant violent extremism discourse. The first one is that it's been very much driven by Western perspectives on Western perceptions of security challenges. And indeed, a lot of both the strategies, state strategies for fighting violent extremism in the Western Balkans, or in the Balkans more broadly, as well as also the funding for NGOs, has been coming from Western donors and Western policy setters who have been seeing violent extremism through the lens of radical Islam as being a threat, in particular when it comes to the recruitment of foreign fighters, which had its peak during the success of the Islamic State. Now, this is something which is, again, a specific perspective, which I think we should take critically, because from the perspective of the Western Balkans, there's been very few instances of domestic terrorism based on violent extremism, on radical Islam. And one has to really wonder whether or not this is appropriate as the main lens to study this phenomena. The second element we see with the identification of radical Islam as the main lens of violent extremism, and this is something we experience in the MENA region more, is justifying non-democratic policies. We're seeing this particular with our colleagues studying Egypt, where the clampdown and anti-democratic kind of coup we've been experiencing has been justified with anti-violent extremism policies. So there we have the big problem that what puts itself into the larger global debate of fighting violent extremism is in fact an attempt to destroy democratic pluralism. And so this is a second problem of this discourse. The third one is, of course, a global anti-Islamic discourse we're seeing quite strong, which has become very potent, not just in the far right, although we see it in European far right parties, but also in mainstream West European discourse. Remind you of Emmanuel Macron's statement that Bosnia-Herzegovina is a ticking time bomb, which he stated a few years ago, which is completely devoid of any empirical basis, but presents again the image that Muslim communities in Europe are a security threat. And it securitizes Muslim communities and sees them primarily through the lens of either are they drivers or are they, how can they stop violent extremism? But it puts the burden on Muslim communities rather than looking at the problem more broadly and also other drivers of radicalization and violent extremism. It is within this kind of global discourse and European discourse of anti-Islamic discourse, and that we also find in the Balkans, nationalist discourse fitting itself in and being able to, in a certain way, present itself as part of a larger debate. And this is something which, again, I think reinforces exclusionary thinking and a particular lens which gives the focus on violent extremism as nearly overwhelmingly a Muslim problem, quote unquote. Now, and this is exactly something which we're trying to do in our project. We're trying to say, well, actually, in the Western Balkans, we have other drivers and other types of violent extremism, which in some cases is openly violent, other ones threatens violence. And in fact, this is something which is much more associated with nationalist movements of different sorts. I mean, it is, maybe appropriate to remind you here that it was just the other day that the entrance to Women in Black in Belgrade was smeared with hate speech and graffiti evoking a war criminal. Now, this is the kind of evoking or kind of violent extremism I'm talking about, which seems to be more relevant and more potent and more dangerous in many ways across the Western Balkans than necessarily the threat of a particular type of radical Islam. Now, to come to my second part, to look at some of the drivers of violent extremism, if we conceptualize it more broadly and not just through the lens of Islam. Our project looks at different drivers: territorial inequalities, economic deprivation, political grievances, cultural factors, religion as well, digital literacy, and transnational dynamics. And well, one thing which emerges quite clearly in the Western Balkans is there isn't a simple, and I think my previous speakers have said this in the case studies, there isn't a simple causal mechanism. And this, of course, is something we find also in the MENA region, that it is not just economic deprivation or marginalization, which in itself explains radicalization and violent extremism. So there is no easy way to understand it. I think two important observations which we have found is that first of all, a key source which is, let's say, local, is the strength of institutions and the ability of institutions to prevent violent extremism and, in a certain way, radicalization. But of course, there we find a very ambiguous relationship, and this is something which the previous speaker have also already alluded to, is that often institutions are countering it by co-opting ideas of violent extremism. So we find it in the whole spectrum of different types of radical ideas and groups. So we find it both that, hooligan groups and far-right nationalist groups are often controlled by political actors, by political parties and groups with a greater relevance. Or we've seen a similar phenomena that religious institutions have often co-opted or absorbed some of the more radical elements in an attempt to pacify them. But of course, this strategy often serves also those actors to extend their influence. And this can be also giving these ideas legitimacy and space. So this kind of institutional co-optation and absorption is a particular phenomena which can also be dangerous, because again, we find many of the far-right extremist groups in kind of certain way pacified, but also controlled, but still relevant. Now, the other element is, of course, the transnational, which is very strong. The idea that actually a lot of the radicalization is based on multiple types of transnational engagement. Diasporic groups are extremely important, and this is something which has emerged very clearly. The creating of these spaces of radicalization, sharing of ideas virtually, but also what we call, or what I would call, civilizational politics, which I think is a term to describe transnational alliances of radical groups, which could be aligned along religious lines, but also along some other lines. So we find, just like we find people who were radicalized on Islamic lines fighting for ISIS, we also find people radicalized on nationalist Orthodox lines from Serbia, for example, fighting in Eastern Ukraine. And again, it's this claim of civilizational alliances which underpins a lot of that logic. And I think rather than studying those as separate phenomena, we should study them very much closely as being closely interlinked and related. And of course, if we accept this idea that there are these civilizational arguments, again, I'm not saying that they are legitimate arguments, but they are arguments for radicalization, then we are escaping the trap of looking just in one particular religious or national community. And then finally, to kind of leave with a thought based on the comparison of the MENA region and the Western Balkans, because one phenomenon, of course, which emerges very clearly when one looks at people who have joined violent groups, that the number is much more significant in the MENA region than it is in the Western Balkans. So that does raise the question of why it is not happening so much in the Western Balkans than it is in the MENA region. And when we're looking at the data with our colleagues from the different countries, I mean, one of the kind of important differences are, and that's maybe something to think about, because these could be, both drivers of resilience to some degree, or what we're talking about. One is that migration is an exit strategy in the Western Balkans, which it is much less so for the MENA region. So people who are dissatisfied with their status quo can leave in a way which is not accessible for citizens in the MENA region. Of course, the demographic picture is fundamentally different. The Balkans is overall an aging population, with the MENA region having quite a different picture. So the kind of people who would be logical logical victims or actors of radicalization don't exist in the same number in the Balkans. The type of institutional control is different in terms of both the religious institutions are more independent from the state than the MENA region, and are thus able to kind of develop their own policies to a greater degree. And then finally, nationalism exists as a force which can fragment in a certain way, or disempower the kind of civilizational dimension. But of course, this kind of absorption has its own risks and dangers, which I've been already alluding to. So to wrap up, this research is still ongoing. We're conducting further field work as we're speaking across the region. But I think the most important point I want to conclude with is really to kind of be careful about the way in which violent extremism is framed, and actually looking at it in the Balkans, to move away from an exclusive focus on violent extremism associated with Islam, and rather understanding it in the broader framework with other types of extremism, in particular radical nationalism and this concept of civilizationalism, which I've outlined. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bieber. And thank you also for this note of caution as for the comparability between cases and regions. And I think in particular also the emphasis on the need to critically reflect on the discourse and the concepts that we use, and whether they are applicable in other regions is extremely important. And yeah, we could go on that, but I will now open up the floor to the audience for questions, comments. So please raise your hand. We have 13 minutes. Okay, we have one here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bojan Jelek, Belgrade Center for Security Policy. Thank you for this very fresh and interesting research that you presented. I have a question about I think Professor Bieber mentioned it towards the end, about the right-wing extremism that he touched upon, and the relationship with the Islamic extremism, because I know for sure in Serbia, but maybe in some other regions as well, they feed off of each other. So what is the relation between these two? And then Mania mentioned the slippery slope of policy. So if you encountered any good practices locally on the policy responses to extremism, or some policy failures or blunders in the region. So these will be two questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, Mr. Bieber, do you want to go first?
Sure, glad. Thanks for the question. I mean, I think, again, if we look at those groups as being kind of the same type of phenomena, I mean, whether they are radical Islamist groups or far-right nationalist activists, I mean, again, I fully agree with you. They feed on each other, and they give each other legitimacy, because, again, we say the nationalist discourse, which is often, especially among non-Islamic nations, so to speak, very anti-Muslim and harks back to the 90s often to justify some of its positions. And on the other side, radical Islamic groups justify their position often through being marginalized and being threatened. So again, these are mutually reinforcing tendencies. So we should study them together as being this, not just mutually reinforcing, but often having the same drivers, having the same kind of elements which drive them, rather than seeing radical Islam as an outlier, rather see it as a pattern of different types of radical groups. I would make the same demand for Western Europe. We can't just kind of isolate it from the study. So I think from that point of view, this is I think very important to bear in mind. And thanks for the question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Maria, do you want to come in?
Thank you, Brian, for your question as well. I would also like to use the opportunity to touch upon something that Professor Bieber also said regarding the concept of violent extremism, and why we actually focused here on the region of Sanjak is because we try to focus on resilience, not the threat of and drivers of radicalization. That's why we chose this region and this particular form of extremism. But I couldn't agree more that far-right extremism is a far bigger threat in the Western Balkans, and also has not been paid enough attention both by the international community, academia, as well as policy researchers. And when it comes to good practices or good policy solutions that might be recommended for decision makers, well, I mentioned some of the examples. For instance, the case of Asad Kundakovic, who is a respectable individual who dedicated a lot of time to understand at first and to educate himself, and then to speak to young people who have demonstrated signs of radicalization, let's say. And he spoke a lot to them, also spoke publicly in different workshops, and also gave media statements, so on. Besides that, I think that also what Evlogi mentioned, investing in religious education can be quite important in preventing and building resilience, actually. And finally, what I didn't mention in my presentation, also some NGO initiatives that promoted, let's say, this dialogue between different ethnic communities or different religious communities can be very beneficial for building resilience without any risks of slipping into radicalization.
Thank you so much. I have another question there.
Thank you. I have actually two questions, one for Charles and one for Maria. Maybe first to start with Charles. So you're a veteran doing research on a veteran by applying ethnographic methods, right? So I see all myriad of challenges there. So maybe can you just in like 2 minutes elaborate on your positionality of doing this kind of research? Because I will try to put myself in your skin, and I'm not really sure I could do that. So if you have something to tell us about this, that would be very interesting for me to hear. And for Maria, because we are doing very similar research, so what we found, and I would like to hear your opinion, that when it comes to Sanjak, that also kind of, I don't know how to frame this politically correct, but nepotism also works as a resilience in a sense that, I mean, not resilience, but it's also working against violent extremism, because state is also financing all these groups that exist there, and they are trying to tap into each of them. So do you think that this is actually a factor of resilience and radicalization at the same time? Because from what we have seen is actually the state is very present, financing all these groups, I mean, different representatives of Muslim groups there, and it seems that everybody are actually satisfied in one way or another. So that would be my actual question. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question here. I think if it's okay with you, we'll take that first.
Thank you, Kari, and thanks to the panelists for a very interesting presentation. I am Morten Bøås, research professor at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. I would just really like the panelists to spend a minute or two, if possible, to reflect on how resilience to violent extremism in this particular parts of Europe that you have covered, how it also relates to what we may call constrained livelihoods. And by that I mean people's aspirations for something better, for a better future that in many parts of this world has not necessarily been met. Not necessarily that people have sort of fallen into immense poverty, but rather that people had, at various times here in the areas you have worked, people have had at least some sort of aspirations for a better future. I think that can also be related to part of your work, Charles. I mean, these aspirations for a better future that suddenly is seen as unfulfilled, something that should have come, that has not come, and how this in a way leads to at least some people questioning the status quo, searching for new alternatives. And in your research, I mean, how does this play out? And what do your research tell us about how this can be addressed? This is just a matter of that politics needs to start delivering, or is there also something that can be introduced at a local level that at least can alleviate some of these problems that this unfulfilledness creates among certain segments of the population? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Morten. We have 5 minutes left, and I have also a question from the online audience. So if you allow me, I will ask this question as well, and then I will give all of you, the panelists, the turn, so you can answer those of the questions that were posed that you would like to answer. So the online question goes as follows. How would you address the trend of growing radicalization and extremism among the youth across Western Balkan countries? So, anyone who would like to start answering? Charles, do you want to start? Yes, please.
Well, we gather our thoughts. I can speak quite quickly to just a very 1,000-meter overview of the first question. I think one of the things that really kind of structures how I am in the field and the conversations that I have, and also the different dynamics of these relationships within research and in Southeast Europe, kind of speaks to the use of the word veteran just in general. That's really been kind of an ongoing conversation that's constantly forcing me to kind of shift my positionality in my use of the word veteran. As an American combat veteran, I have one kind of personal, social understanding of the word veteran, but that's very much a North Atlantic-centered, a North American-centric use of the word. Whereas if you use the word in Belgium, or you use the word in Croatia, or you use the word in Serbia, you're getting a myriad of reflections and perceptions. So that's really been kind of difficult to kind of make sure that I'm being self-reflexive of my own positionality with the word veteran, and then also trying to really get my head around how other people use this word veteran. And in a sense, this really kind of speaks to one aspect of a shared aspect across the ocean and across cultures, is the sense of past tenseness that comes along with the word veteran. There seems to be an implicit kind of past tense dynamic to the word that is both in the United States and Croatia, Serbia, Kosovo, where have you, Egypt, Bulgaria. There's that dynamic. So there's a shifting positionality that I'm always trying to be aware of, but also and I'll end on this just real quick, is the suspicion that comes along with it. The suspicion that you encounter as a veteran of NATO, as a veteran of the American military. There's a understandable suspicion where, okay, well, why is this veteran here to speak with me as a veteran? What's the motives? What's he trying to get at and everything? So that's really been part of the positionality of myself as a veteran with other veterans in Southeast Europe. For this, just real quick, for the second question, the constrained livelihoods, when you were speaking about this and inhibited futures, it reminded me of a conversation I had in Croatia not too long ago, where I was trying to figure out how we translate the idea that some people are waiting for a future that has already passed. So when we were talking about this, when we were trying to think through this, we were trying to figure out how that translates into Croatian, and that actually took over the entire conversation about how this actually gets translated and how we would actually use this as a way of understanding some of the constrained livelihoods or the aspirations. As to a solution to this dynamic, I can only raise my hands and point to a couple of the trends that were mentioned earlier with the age demographics, the exodus of youth from Southeast Europe, former Yugoslavia and beyond, I think is really kind of undermining any kind of aspirations in very much the imagined sense of the word, the speculations for the future, what kind of futures, if we can pluralize it, what kind of futures we can be expecting. So I think the age demographic is something that really has to be brought into that conversation. Unfortunately, that's not really the area where I'm strongest, perhaps.
Okay, thank you so much. Evlogi, do you want to go next?
Okay. On youth radicalization, I think concerning the North Macedonian case, youth radicalization is a very serious issue, according to our observations. And this is for two reasons. First, the youth is becoming more and more, the voice of the youth is becoming more and more visible nowadays. And this is mostly due to the access in social media. But along this goes the process of extremist content, which is much more easy accessible now. Which is a very strong issue in North Macedonia because there is no legislation which can prohibit already posted online extremist content. There are even cases when some of the former recruiters for ISIS were incarcerated, but their online content remained in the media, which is a very strong problem. And this goes to the second point, which confirms what Professor Boas told about the disappointment for the non-reached better future. This goes exactly for North Macedonia now because we saw very big disappointment due to the suspension of the Euro integration process of North Macedonia, due to the complicated negotiations between North Macedonia and Bulgaria, and this was strictly related by many of our respondents with increase of, well, let's say not extremist content, but radicalization indeed, and nationalist radicalization. This is absolutely instrumentalized by now the opposition in North Macedonia, the VMRO DPMNE, and it can lead to even more increasing radicalization in the near future if the process of Euro integration of North Macedonia is not finished.
Thank you so much. Maria, do you want to?
Yes, I will answer Neveni's question. Thank you very much for mentioning this interesting example of political corruption. In theory, yes, that could be deemed as resilience, but I would argue that it could only have short-term effects on resilience of the community and to a very narrow group of maybe potential, let's say, radical individuals. Rather than that, political corruption should be definitely seen and characterized as a driver of radicalization. And I'm glad that you mentioned that because political divisions and political corruption in the region of Sandžak are very severe, and they have divided the community on all levels of everyday life, in all aspects of their everyday lives. And in that sense, political corruption and these divisions are a great driver of political extremism, not religious extremism. And we have witnessed various incidents, armed incidents in the past few months, so that's definitely an issue that should be paid greater attention in terms of Sandžak. But political corruption, I think, should not be deemed as resilience.
Thank you so much. And then Florian, the floor is yours, if you want to answer some of these.
I'll be very brief. I mean, I think to the online question also, the growing radicalization of young people, I mean, I think what we're seeing is often states are drivers of radicalization. I mean, in terms of promoting in educational content, nationalist narratives. And I think what has been mentioned, corruption or lack of responsive government, of course, also radicalize people. So you have both radicalization through official communication of the history of the past, as well and also through kind of groups which are often controlled by governments in the region, as well as by dissatisfaction with the governments and their lack of response. So I think this is a problem. And we've done a survey with BPAG recently, which shows that it's the young people who are the most reserved about joining the European Union across the Western Balkans in every single country. It's the youngest group of citizens who are the least favorable in terms of joining the European Union, and it's the oldest people who are the most in favor of joining the European Union. I mean, that tells you a very troubling picture. And I think it's got something to do also with the fact, as I mentioned earlier, those who do want to change, they have the exit option, which of course can work de-radicalization, that those who are dissatisfied can leave. But of course, in terms of the question of change and, you know, creating a society which isn't just kind of coping with extremism and reproducing it, but actually fighting it in terms of providing a better alternative, that is not helpful. So I think we're actually kind of stuck in the region with maybe not much violent extremism, but not tackling the underlying structural issues which are causing the kind of the problems in terms of attitudes, which can then be mobilized by governments and other structures in certain moments of crisis.
Thank you so much, Florian, and thank you so much to the panelists for excellent presentations, for sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you to the audience in real life and online. And we are now going to have a coffee break. We will reconvene at 1:30, but please join me in a big hand of applause to the panelists.